Well, as we continue our look at coalitions and how different political parties are sometimes working together, sometimes working against each other, and sometimes just doing their own thing, one of the parties which has become a consistent member of coalitions is the Freedom Front Plus. It's part of a coalition agreement led really by the DA in metros like Ekhuruleni, Tshwane and Joburg, also part of a group of parties that say they're working together to take over from the ANC-led coalition in Nelson Mandela Bay. Dr. Corne Mulder is the Chief Whip of the Freedom Front Plus. Dr. Mulder, good afternoon to you and thank you for your time. You're obviously one of the smaller parties, I'm afraid to say, in most of these coalitions. You've been a part of coalitions going back, I think, to 2006 in Cape Town. How have you found the experience over the years?
Well, I think we've grown to a very large extent in South Africa dealing with coalitions. Yes, you are correct. The first, I would say, real coalition was in 2006 in the city of Cape Town, when after that election, no single party obtained a majority on their own, and we were forced to form a coalition. And that was, I would say, a first experiment with coalitions, and then later on we saw that again in 2016 and now again. But I think it evolved quite considerably from 2006. 2006 was really a first experiment. It was a group of small parties that came together, and in the end, one vote made the difference to have Helen Zille then elected as mayor, and then we could take it further from there.
I mean, so many things were happening at the time, because a few years later, you actually worked with the ANC and national government. Maybe it wasn't a formal coalition, but your leader at the time, Peter Mulder, was the Deputy Minister of Agriculture under then-President Jacob Zuma. What was that experience like?
Yes, let me first of all say that was no coalition at all. There was no coalition agreement, and the important thing was also that the ANC obviously didn't need that support. They had a clear majority in government. They didn't need the support of any other party to form a coalition, so it was not a coalition. What basically happened was that Mr. Zuma was then president. He reached out to our party at that stage, after the election when he became president, and extended an invitation for us to serve as the Deputy Minister of Agriculture. Now, that is part of our constituency. And before we took up that position, we consulted quite broadly with a number of different stakeholders in the agricultural sector, and the advice was unanimous that we should take it up. Whether it was a success or not, that's a different discussion. I think it was difficult because it's very difficult under those circumstances. The ANC has got its own agenda, and it's very difficult then to steer things in the direction that you would like to see that happening.
I mean, it's interesting because you did it then. I don't know if you would do it now, because I remember during the campaigns last year in the local elections, and local and national can be different, but I think quite clearly your spokespeople I spoke to said that they would not enter any coalition with the ANC in local government. And yet, just a few years ago, you were quite happy to work with the former president.
Well, yes, I agree with that. I think we've also perhaps learned a lesson in the sense that in 2008, 2009, when this happened, we were still of a view, and we hoped that the ANC could be convinced to do the right thing. But our experience since then indicated that maybe there's no such thing as a good or a bad ANC, it's just the ANC. And we are convinced that in the best interest of the country, we need to replace the ANC at all levels as government. And that's what we're busy with, and we made that very clear in the run-up to the 2019 national election as well as to the 2021 local elections last year.
I mean, it's clear, everyone can see this, that we're likely to head to a bigger era of coalitions. Never mind national government for a moment. It's a distracting picture, but certainly in the provinces we're going to have, I'm sure in Gauteng, possibly in the Free State, possibly in the Western Cape, possibly in the Northern Cape, we're likely to have coalitions, KwaZulu-Natal as well. To your mind, based on your experience, this may be a too big a question, are there some features which make a coalition run well and some which make them run badly? I imagine you've been members of both at one time or another.
Yes, absolutely, no doubt. The first point I would like to make is that our electoral system basically begs for coalition government. We don't have a constituency-based system. Normally, in a strict constituency-based system, it makes for a two-party system where you've got two bigger parties and that's it. But in a proportional system like we've got, you'll also always have a number of political parties competing for political power, and we've seen in Parliament for the last couple of elections, we always end up with more than 10 political parties. At the moment, I think we are 14 parties in Parliament. So that's just the reality. And then if you look at what happened in 2016, we did have some coalitions, but they failed. Most of them, or basically all of them failed. One I think, succeeded right to the end, but that was in a smaller council called Hesekwa in the Southern Cape. And the reason they failed was, I think, the point of departure was wrong. Most of those coalitions were based on the premise their negotiations took place around positions. We want to be the mayor, you support us, and then we'll support you to become the speaker, and this. It was all about positions. And then some interesting thing happened. In December of 2019, a multi-party delegation visited Germany on invitation from the German government. We were represented there were members from the ANC, from the Democratic Alliance, Freedom Front Plus, ACDP, UDM, and some others. And we went to have a discussion about how does the Germans do their coalitions. And I think when we came back, we learned a lot of lessons. So when we came to 2021, and that whole process was a different process, the last thing that we discussed in these negotiations dealt with positions. We started off from a completely different perspective, and we negotiated agreements that were signed by other parties, and right at the end we composed the governments. And in that sense, I think that's the right way to do it. So if you start off on the wrong foot with parties that you do not really have something in common, and it's all only about individual positions, I can assure you it won't last. But if you try it the other way around, who knows, maybe it will succeed.
Is there a risk for smaller parties in particular? So let me give you a sort of series of examples of what I mean. In Cape Town, you and other parties joined the DA under Helen Ziller, as she was then the mayor of Cape Town. In the end, the DA's share of the vote grew to the point where they were able to then form an administration without any of the smaller parties. In the ANC's case, they, after working with you in government for 5 years, they then gave a seat to the National Freedom Party. And that party in the end sort of divided itself. There were divisions there. In Ekhuruleni in Gauteng, the ANC formed a coalition government with the African Independence Congress, the AIC. And again, that party sort of divided itself, isn't nearly as strong as it used to be. The point I'm trying to make is, are there severe electoral risks for smaller parties to go into a coalition where they can be dominated, maybe bullied, a better word, damaged, infiltrated perhaps, by a bigger, more dominant player?
Absolutely. I think it's a serious risk, and parties must take note of that, and they must make sure that that does not happen. For example, in the current coalition agreements that we've signed with all the different parties, one of the first points are very clear there, that there will be no some party-led coalition. I know that sometimes people would refer to the coalitions in the Gauteng, the metros, as being DA-led. And we all object to that very strongly because there's a provision that clearly states no coalition is led by anyone. We need to refer to them as multi-party coalition governments. And we obviously have those discussions quite often. But there are definitely risks that smaller parties may be absorbed in the sense that if they don't defend their own identity and project their own identity, they may run that risk. So in the current agreements, we've gone a long way in that sense, and it's up to the parties. We remain different political parties that will compete. We are convinced that come 2024, we will still have the situation that no single party is going to be a majority from the opposition side, the current opposition side, and you'll be forced to have coalitions. And in that sense, you need to protect your power base, your electoral base, and make sure that you're not absorbed by a bigger party. We understand that very much.
There are other issues as well. So, I mean, for example, in Tshwane at the moment, there's a dispute between the DA, which you've just told me not to call it the DA-led administration, so let me say the DA mayor. They now, Randall Williams, he's under fire from Action SA. Now, these are two of the bigger partners in Tshwane, if I can call them that. You probably, as a smaller party, as a member of that administration, have to choose between them. How do you choose between them?
No, not really. Let me just give you some feedback. In terms of the current coalition agreements, and we've got about 80 hung councils in South Africa after the 2021 election. Some of them are governed by the ANC in their kind of coalitions, but a lot of these coalitions are by former opposition parties. And in the coalition agreement, we basically made it very clear in creating certain structures. So one of the structures created in the coalition agreement, specifically with regard to the metros in Gauteng, is what is known as the COG. It's called the Coalition Oversight Group. And that body consists of the national leaders of the different parties involved, also the provincial leaders, as well as the leaders in the local council themselves. So Tuesday last week, we had a meeting of the COG, the COG, which dealt the whole day basically with the Tshwane issue. The coalition agreement states that that body needs to elect a chairperson at every meeting. I was elected chairperson, so I had to steer that process. Now, if we come to Tshwane, for example, the Freedom Front Plus is not one of the smaller parties. We and Action SA basically has almost the same number of seats. I think Action SA has got 19, we've got 17, and the DA then I think has got 69. So what basically happened was there was this misunderstanding or this difference of opinion with regard to how that process was handled by the mayor, Mr. Williams, and we had to resolve that issue. And then obviously what happens is, and we don't have a normal situation in South Africa. We don't have a situation where the former governing party in these coalitions, the ANC, now accepts that they have lost power and now behave as a loyal opposition and allow the others to govern. That's not happening. So we have to contend basically on a weekly basis with challenges from the former governing party, the ANC or the EFF, trying to disrupt the success of these coalitions. So obviously when they sensed that there was some division within the coalition with regard to the issue in the city of Tshwane, they immediately then suggested to bring that motion of no confidence, which they then did. They brought it last Thursday. It was supported by the EFF and ANC. But in the end, when it became clear to them that the coalition is stable and that the coalition have decided not to have any division amongst each other and to follow a different route, in the end they knew that they would be defeated. So they tried to break the quorum, which they can't do because we are a clear majority. So they walked out, the ANC walked out, the EFF walked out. It was about 3 o'clock in the morning. And then that motion was brought to the table and it was defeated.
Thank you very much indeed. Do appreciate the time. There's a lot to get through when you look at issues around that. Dr. Corne Mulder is the Chief Whip of the Freedom Front Plus. A look at the issues around coalitions. Won't be the last time we talk about coalitions, I'm fairly certain. In a moment.